Pony Courtship Rituals by Codex X Equus. Chapter 8. Changling Courtship Rituals. It was pointless, but Queen Chrysalis pushed herself upright in her bed anyway. What she wanted to do was just lie there, like she had for the vast majority of the last few days. Just lie in her bed and do nothing. Not even think. Just doze, just stare at the ceiling. And there was also the temptation to do what she had told Twilight she would, and sleep for the rest of time. But she still had responsibilities. The smooth integration of her hive with Equestria had to be assured. If she wasn't going to be around in the future to guide her changelings and help them steal love, they'd need the ponies as a voluntary source of sustenance to survive. She'd also have to appoint a regent, pick lieutenants to run things in her absence, possibly even set up departments among her changelings to specialize in handling the different responsibilities involved in running a hive. She could guide the hive mind in her sleep, but without her personal involvement the changelings would need a government that wasn't just her telling them what to do. And besides, Twilight had written her a letter. She'd barely been able to bring herself to read it, and her sight of the words had been blurred by tears, but the gist had been easy enough to glean. Today, Twilight would be coming to the hive to get the last of her things. She had left very few belongings behind, mostly books, but also a few personal effects. Chrysalis had to make sure all of that was out of her quarters and the hive itself, so Twilight would have no reason to enter. So after a few moments of sitting listlessly on the bed, Chrysalis pushed herself to its side and slid off. She stood for a moment, then slumped to her haunches, head drooping. She didn't even notice her mane falling limply to encircle her head. She just stared down at the floor beneath her hooves, mind blank. She winced momentarily when she finally moved, her muscles sore after being unused for so long while she was lying in her bed. Giving her head a shake, she sent her mane tumbling into a position that was at least somewhat close to how she normally wore it. As she shook her head, she caught a glimpse of the letter from Twilight she had received the night before, and winced again. She really should destroy that letter, along with all of the newspaper clippings and photos and such of Twilight that she had collected in her scrapbook over the years. But she didn't want to forget. No matter how it hurt, she wanted to remember the pony she loved so much. Turning away from the nightstand, Chrysalis looked for her breakfast, and her eyes narrowed menacingly when she noted the absence of a tray with her meal on it. She told her attendants exactly when she intended to wake up and what she wanted to eat, and yet there was nothing here now. If they thought her lethargy meant they could slack off, they were about to learn many new and painful things. Striding to the entrance to her quarters, she swept the curtain aside, and her eyes widened as she found her attendants and guards nowhere to be seen. One corner of her mouth curled up as she let out a low hiss. Now, for the first time in days, she felt something. Oh, she felt something indeed. A pool of anger bubbling up inside her like lava, pushing aside her earlier apathy. How dare her changelings abandon their posts? Dimly, she felt gratitude towards them for at least partially breaking through her despondence. But mostly what she felt was an all-consuming rage. Grimly, she fired up her horn, making contact with the hive mind and getting ready to dispense swift and brutal, but deserved, justice. And then froze. The hive mind was empty. After the first moment of stunned shock had passed, she began sweeping her mind through their shared consciousness, frantically searching every dark corner for some sign of her changelings, but all she found was blank nothingness. Panic growing, she began to lurch from spot to spot in the hive mind, desperate to find any hint of her changelings, before finally forcing herself to stop and drop fully back into reality. They can't all be gone, she told herself firmly, breathing hard. There has to be some sign of them somewhere. Once she'd calmed down, she entered the hive mind once again, this time more cautiously. She probed around, seeking any sign, any hint of what had happened to her changelings. At first she found nothing. It all seemed exactly the same, except she couldn't feel any other minds, at all. Which should have been impossible, unless some kind of powerful spell was there. At the edges, she caught just the faintest hint of a changling. It was bare, little more than a ghost, but it gave her a direction. She followed it, only to find that after a short distance, to her surprise, she could go no further. Something was blocking her. A wall, almost, keeping her separated from the rest of the hive mind. Again, impossible. But the hive mind was hers, and she would not let anyone keep her from using it as she saw fit. Her horn began to glow brighter, as she attempted to force her way forward. There was resistance, but she had centuries of experience with the hive mind, and she wouldn't be stopped. "You think you can defy me?" she growled, eyes clenched, speaking out loud without realizing it. "I am the queen." For a moment, she slipped past whatever barrier had been set up. Just for the barest fraction of a moment, and what she got could barely be called a glimpse. But it was enough, and stunned, she hardly even noticed when she got pushed back out again. All her changelings were being kept from her. Whatever the barrier was, they were all behind it. She'd gotten a feeling in the second she had touched them. She didn't know what she'd felt, but she knew it made her mad. It had felt like they were mocking her, almost. But she'd also gotten something else from the touch, a physical location. She knew where they were now. Just outside the entrance to the hive. Face set in a grim frown, Chrysalis started off down the tunnels of the hive. Something or someone had taken her changelings, and they were going to pay. In blood, preferably, but she could think of all sorts of other fun choices. As she stomped her way towards the entrance, though, her mind took another turn. The hive was so empty. So quiet. Normally it was filled with busy, purposeful activity. Changelings rushing to and fro as they dug new tunnels, prepared to raid a town of ponies and harvest love, or just went on their way to take care of any of the hundreds of odd jobs that a living, breathing hive required to survive. And now there was nothing. Just the heavy clap of her hooves echoing back at her off the tunnel walls. Just her, by herself, all alone. She had trouble finding a word to describe the experience, but finally came upon one. Creepy. It wasn't a word used often by a love-devouring, shape-changing, slime-secreting changling, but it fit. Is this what it's like for Twilight right now, all alone in her castle? Wondered Chrysalis. She doesn't have any changelings either. Just like me. No, of course this wasn't what things were like for Twilight, she realized a moment later. Twilight had friends, Twilight had family, Twilight had all manner of ponies and other creatures to keep her company. Chrysalis only had her changelings, and with them cut from the hive mind, she now had no one. She slowed, surprised as she realized what the strange feeling she had was. She was lonely. Her changelings had always been with her, of course, so this was the first time she'd ever truly been alone, with not even the hive mind to rely on. But even then, after everything she had experienced with Twilight, at some point she had come to feel lonely and hadn't even realized it until now. Even the hive mind hadn't been enough to fill that gap. It wasn't exactly like talking to herself, but like a shadow, an echo of her own thoughts. Her changelings had their own wills and thoughts, but those thoughts naturally tended to line up with her own. She'd never known until recently what it was like to actually interact with ponies. In ways that didn't involve deceiving them and controlling their minds. And now, strangely, she missed the experience. Rainbow Dash, Applejack, Pinkie Pie, Fluttershy, Rarity, Spike, Princess Luna. Especially Luna, for some reason she couldn't quite put a hoof on. She missed them all. She found she actually wouldn't mind having one of them around now. Provided they didn't bother her, or talk, or do anything disrespectful, of course, but she still would have enjoyed their company. She would have even accepted Starlight Glimmer, the dead pony who was living in Twilight's castle and trying to steal her away. Her gait, already slow, came to a halt as a series of thoughts suddenly raced through her head. she want friends? No, of course not. Of course not. She didn't have friends. She thought Twilight would change things. But she'd been wrong about that. Sadly so, and it simply reinforced the point that a queen did not have friends. Although princesses did. And they seemed just as respected as queens. Feared, even, though maybe not as openly as Chrysalis herself was. If they could have friends, and still maintain their dignity and their control over Equestria, was there any reason she couldn't? Was she really so different? Her changelings didn't seem to think so. With sort of vague disapproval, she had watched their first tentative steps towards fitting in among the ponies. No matter her feelings for Twilight, she couldn't see the ponies as anything more than the food source. But the other changelings had taken to them like ants to ice cream, to use a fitting but rather unflattering comparison. Rather unnervingly, she'd noticed feelings in the hive mind starting to form towards the princesses. Her changelings respected Celestia and Luna, in a way they previously had only Chrysalis. The ponies had told tales of the princesses to her changelings, and as those tales spread through the hive mind, the changelings' respect for them only grew. Somehow, their brand of leadership, of kindness and understanding, had won them the same deference from the ponies that Chrysalis got from her changelings through unwavering discipline, and occasionally fear. And, perhaps most disturbing of all, some changelings had questioned her. Normally such an unprecedented act would bring swift retribution, but they'd asked her to be nicer. To find compromises to problems that made everyone happy. To be friendly. She'd been so confused by the requests that she had simply denied them in a huff, and the displeasure that radiated through the hive mind as she'd done so had quickly discouraged any other changelings from doing the same. Dad had still gnawed at her, though. All she needed to do was look at Equestria to see how things could be. It was a large nation, a powerful nation, full of happy citizens. And Celestia and Luna had done all that peacefully. They'd fought only in self-defense, instead relying on harmony and understanding to build their kingdom. She had indulged Twilight during all the times the pony had spoken of the power of friendship, listening patiently despite her own lack of faith in such a thing. Or, at least, that it was as strong as Twilight claimed. But now, as she reflected upon it in her loneliness, was friendship actually magic? If so, perhaps there was another way to rule. If the princesses could do it, then maybe she could do the same. The shape of a new world formed inside her mind. One where changelings were friendly, spreading out across Equestria, earning their love rather than stealing it. They might not know much about friendship right now, but they could learn. Next to communication, knowing things was what the hive mind was best at. And that aside, the hive mind already had a multitude of skills, gathered throughout the generations. There was so much in Equestria they could help with, so much they could fix, so many ponies they could make happy. And Chrysalis herself. Maybe she really could learn what it took to be a friend to other ponies. Ponies who weren't just Twilight. She could become a beacon of friendship, leading her changelings in spreading its magic across the land. She could be a gracious queen, beloved by ponies and changelings alike. And maybe, just maybe, Twilight would see that, and realize Chrysalis had changed. Maybe it would open her heart up, the way it could have been, the way it should have been from the start, if only Chrysalis hadn't misunderstood things so terribly. That might be hoping for too much, but regardless, she could build a new world. She could ensure her people not only survived, but prospered. She could make the changelings, and herself, as loved in Equestria as the princesses themselves. Maybe, she could even be nice. Thoughts bouncing around in her head, visions of a world of harmony and friendship led by changelings dancing before her mind's eye. Chrysalis resumed walking, unconsciously following the path she had been on before her revelation. She threaded her way through the tunnels with familiar ease, not even having to watch where she was going as she ruminated on her revelation. Then she rounded the final bend and exited the hive. Seeing what was waiting for her, she snapped back to reality and stood frozen in place, eyes wide. She had built this hive in the Macintosh Hills, down in southern Equestria. The reasoning had been simple: placing the hive in already existing caves was easier than burrowing it out themselves, and the Macintosh Hills were riddled with tunnels. And as a bonus, the hills gave her a spectacular view of much of Equestria, including Twilight's current home, Ponyville. Aside from her beloved's castle, it was still a beautiful sight. The hillside her hive was built on sloping gently downwards, eventually becoming lost in trees, and the white plains of Equestria beyond that. Right now, the entire hillside spread out below her seemed to be covered with changelings. Her changelings, she realized with a shock, despite the fact that they all seemed to be glowing with a magenta aura. None of them were moving, they stood stock still, faces expressionless as they stared up at her. After the moment of shock passed, she lit up her horn again, forcing her way into the portion of the hive mind the changelings were sharing. She was pushed out again, but now that she was physically near them she'd been able to penetrate much further past that barrier. She hadn't been able to pick up any thoughts, but their emotions had come through clearly. Strangely, there had been no malice. In fact, it had felt just like the normal hive mind, full of love and devotion for her. The only thing different had been a sense of anticipation, a gleeful laughter that she had earlier mistaken for mockery. It is some kind of spell, she thought disbelievingly. But why would someone want to block me out of my own hive mind? And who would have enough raw magical power? I see you made it at last, said a haughty voice from above, and Chrysalis jerked her head upwards. Twilight sparkle floated in the air, wings flapping gently to hold her aloft. Her mouth curled up in what could have been a smile, but the set of her eyes and the arch of her eyebrows turned her expression into a disdainful sneer. And her horn glowed, channeling a spell. The same spell, it was suddenly obvious, that was cutting Chrysalis off from the hive mind. What? You're... Chrysalis tried to speak, but found that she couldn't quite process what she was seeing enough to form a coherent question about it. I can't begin to tell you how happy it makes me that you have decided to agree to my little proposal, continued Twilight with a chuckle that sent a shiver through Chrysalis' carapace. The hive mind. My changelings. Chrysalis finally managed to get out, focusing on what had brought her out here in the first place. Why? Why are you doing this? Ah, yes, you and your little changelings. Twilight peered down at the mass of changelings gathered below her, eyes narrowed in malevolent glee. I had to do something about them before we got to the fun part. I don't want them interfering this time, after all. She held a wickedly happy glare on the Queen, who simply stared back in befuddled lament. Until the bit dropped. Chrysalis' mouth fell open, her pupils shrinking, and she staggered to the side as she remembered where she had heard those words before. She had been the one to say them after all. She shook her head, unable to believe what was happening. But then she looked up to meet Twilight's eyes, and saw it. The pony's eyes were still narrowed, there was still a sneer on her face, but deep in her eyes, just barely visible. Possibly only leaking out because it was Chrysalis she was looking at. There was a faint twinkle. A sparkle. Twilight, you're... I don't understand, Chrysalis finally managed to say, though she was just barely able to get the words out without stammering. After everything that happened. The letter you wrote, it said. Twilight slowly approached her desk. The papers sat on it, waiting. Sitting down in her chair, she began to leaf through the stack of forms. They all seemed fairly standard: initial here, sign this, put a date here, and the pony you're married to will be out of your life forever. There was a familiar pang of sadness at the thought, but thinking of Chrysalis at all anymore brought that feeling. Other than that, she didn't feel anything out of the ordinary. So she began to fill out the paperwork. Initial here, sign this, put a date here. She worked slowly, methodically. She didn't want to mess this up, didn't want to draw things out. Finish it all here, end it all now. Just like Chrysalis wanted. There wasn't much Twilight could do for her anymore, but she could do this right. It would be her last gift to the Queen. That's why she held the quill in her hoof, rather than simply use her magic. This was personal. Finally, Twilight came to the last page. There was one final signature, this one confirming that all of the above signatures were correct and that this truly was what the pony signing wanted. It was the last key that, when turned, would lock all of the chains in place. Signing this would remove Chrysalis from her life forever. Twilight thought all of this, staring at that empty line waiting for her signature, and felt nothing. Nothing that she hadn't felt before. So, with a steady hoof, she signed her name. Then she sat back, staring at her signature, the quill still in her hoof. That was it. Chrysalis was gone now, for good. It was all there, on official palace documents and signed by her, a princess. Now bound by the iron hand of law, she would never, ever, ever see Queen Chrysalis again. The words sang so right there in front of her, in cold black ink. The harsh reality of what that really meant was laying on her desk, and that realization began to beat inside her head to the pulse of her heart. Her hoof started to tremble. Good night, Twilight. Twilight let out a sigh as Chrysalis climbed into bed with her. No matter where she lay, Chrysalis' bulk always pushed the mattress down and caused Twilight to roll back against her. And Chrysalis always took that opportunity to wrap her legs around Twilight and give her a squeeze, nuzzling her face into Twilight's mane. So, as always, Twilight had to rearrange their limbs, freeing her forelegs so they weren't trapped tightly against her barrel. That tended to leave her foreleg draped over Chrysalis in a rather friendly and almost intimate manner, as though they were holding hers as they slept. But somehow she didn't care anymore. The last 3 days? 4? Had it really only been that few? Had been equal parts terrifying and confusing. Her confidence that Chrysalis had been engaged in some long-term plan to trick her had started to waver. At the same time, she still couldn't believe that Chrysalis loved her. Well and truly loved her. She was still waiting for the other horseshoe to drop. And yet, somehow sleeping like this had become normal. Almost comfortable, in a way. It hadn't even been a full week yet, but she still had trouble picturing herself not sleeping with Chrysalis wrapped around her. Good night, Chrysalis, she said hesitantly. As always, that made the changeling happy, and she nestled her head more firmly down onto Twilight's, humming a few notes as she did so. They both drifted off to sleep quickly, but Twilight still heard Chrysalis' sleepy murmur just before falling asleep. "I'll love you." Twilight picked at her food, fork moving with desultory slowness. She'd been in Chrysalis' high for over a week now, and the conclusion was impossible to ignore. Chrysalis did love her. Now she was trapped in an impossible conundrum. She didn't return Chrysalis' love. How could she? The changeling queen was one of the worst enemies she had ever faced, one who had come far too close to taking over Equestria, and she had hurt Twilight's family in the process. To say nothing of the other things she'd done. But at the same time, she couldn't just come out and say that. Chrysalis' reaction was all too predictable. Worse, she would be heartbroken. And while a week ago it would have been hard to find something Twilight cared less about than Chrysalis' feelings, things had changed. She'd slowly started to get to know the changeling, to realize that she had hopes and feelings and dreams just like any other pony. Well, more or less. And now, somehow, Twilight didn't want to hurt her. A sound caught her attention, and she turned, to see Chrysalis let out a feral snarl right in her face. Which would have been terrifying, except Chrysalis had stuck 2 carrots onto her upper fangs, which turned the growl of a monster into something utterly and completely ridiculous. Twilight couldn't help it. Her hoof went to her mouth and she giggled, giving her first real, honest smile since finding out she'd married Chrysalis. Thash better. Chrysali's tongue snaked out, pulling the carrots into her mouth and crunching them up. "You look so pretty when you're smiling." Her guard already lowered by the unexpected silliness Chrysalis had just displayed, Twilight suddenly found herself blushing at the compliment. That immediately sobered her up. She couldn't possibly find anything to like about Chrysalis. Could she? She looked up, to find Chrysalis gazing at her. "I love you, Twilight." Their lips separated, and Twilight stood stunned. It was tradition for the couple to kiss at a wedding. Twilight had known that, and yet had still managed to be surprised when Chrysalis kissed her. The kiss itself hadn't been the only thing to surprise her. The passion in the kiss, the love Chrysalis had managed to get across through such a simple thing as two ponies pushing their lips together. Twilight had kissed Chrysalis before, but compared to this, that had been a simple peck on the cheek. She looked up at Chrysalis, lost in those dual-colored eyes, unable to look away. And, for just a moment, unable to deny the feelings she could feel beginning to stir. In that moment, she wanted this marriage, and she wanted to stay with Chrysalis. It was hard to call it a quiet moment, with both sides of the wedding chapel cheering at the top of their lungs, but there was silence between the two of them until Chrysalis spoke. "I love you." "What happened yesterday?" "I never meant for it to be like that." Twilight looked up, surprised, as Chrysalis spoke into the silence of the Canterlot Library. "The way I left you, I mean. That just wasn't." She trailed off, and Twilight tried not to smile. Chrysalis was clearly attempting to apologize for leaving her during their first date, and was clearly unable to bring herself to actually say she was sorry for something. Twilight considered the Changeling for a moment. She was still mad that Chrysalis had walked out on their date. But this... recreating the date her mother had taken her father on. A date that also happened to be Twilight's exact idea of a perfect date. Well, that was special. As far as Twilight was concerned, that earned a lot of forgiveness. "It's okay, I understand." She pulled Chrysalis close, giving her a quick hug. The Changeling blinked at her in surprise, then smiled. "I love you." They stood on the steps of Twilight's castle, under the glow of the moon, their lips pressed together. They separated, and Twilight, face flushed, smiled up at Chrysalis. "Good night, Twilight," said Chrysalis. "Good night, Chrysalis," Twilight replied, pushing open the door to her castle. "I love you, Twilight." They walked home slowly. It was raining, but they were together so it was fine. Twilight looked over as Chrysalis nudged her with a shoulder, then smiled down at her. "I love you." "I love you, Twilight." "I love you." "I love you." Twilight sat bent over her desk, tears running freely from her eyes. Those tears had done a good job at obliterating her signature on the divorce form, and her quill had finished things off as it was shook about by her hoof until the ink it leaked had turned the entire bottom quarter of the page into one big blot. Now she swept the papers aside, scattering them across the room, and collapsed, sobbing, onto her desk. If this was love, no wonder she had had so much trouble admitting it to herself. Her heart ached and soared at the same time. She missed Chrysalis, like a part of her own body, and just knowing she had signed that stupid divorce form made her want to tear down buildings and raise kingdoms to see the Changeling just one more time. She loved Queen Chrysalis, absolutely and with all her heart. She loved everything about her, the brush of her mane against her cheek-in, the greens of her eyes glinting with mischievousness or promising death to a pony while had upset her arrogance and refusal to admit she was wrong even when she knew she was. Every single thing about Chrysalis was just perfect. Sure, Chrysalis had a streak of megalomania in her. But that didn't even need to be changed, just redirected. With all that energy put towards making Equestria a better place, rather than simply trying to take control of it, there was no telling what they could accomplish. and all her past sins could be forgiven, as well. After all, who hadn't tried to use magic to force a bunch of ponies to do what they wanted? At this point, the list was getting pretty short. In the end, it didn't matter to Twilight what Chrysalis had done in the past. All that mattered was the present, and what Chrysalis would do in the future. And as far as she was concerned, the top two things on those lists were love Twilight and be loved by Twilight. Sniffing, she pushed herself back upright, rubbing at her still wet eyes. Her gaze happened to fall upon the papers she had thrown about the room, and in a fit of anger she gathered them all up and shoved them into a trash can. Then, for good measure, lit it on fire. It was what Chrysalis would have done after all. She might have told a minor untruth to Rainbow Dash when she had said they couldn't just destroy the papers. It was still a felony, that was true. But she was a princess, and the odds that anyone would care she had destroyed official palace documents was minuscule. Besides, even if someone had a problem with what she'd done and actually wanted to press charges, let them try. They'd have to get through her wife first. Assuming, of course, that Chrysalis still wanted to be her wife. Twilight had finally managed to find her love for the Queen, but Chrysalis didn't know that. And, judging by her final words before departing the restaurant, she might not believe it. Simply pleading with her for another chance, for an opportunity to prove her love, wouldn't work. Chrysalis's decision had been too final, her mind too made up. It would take something extraordinary to get her attention, let alone convince her to give Twilight a chance to explain. Twilight frowned in thought. Could Rarity help her? Celestia knew the fashion pony was invested enough in this relationship as it was. She'd kill to be the one to help Twilight put together some romantic spectacle to win back Chrysalis's love. And it would go a long way towards getting Rarity to forgive Twilight for their disagreements over the past few months. Then again, Pinkie Pie could help too. If she wanted something big and eye-catching, Pinkie was definitely the way to go. It would be hard for Chrysalis to ignore a cake baked in the shape of her hive, and to scale, for instance. Plus, Pinkie's ability to go wherever she wanted to would help when it came time to deliver Chrysalis an invitation. But Cadance was the princess of love, and if anyone would know what to do, it would be her. Maybe now that a few days had passed, and Shining Armor had had a chance to talk to her, she would be able to bring herself to help with Chrysalis. That would also be a good step towards patching up their relationship. Or maybe Luna, as Chrysalis's friend. Twilight's thoughts paused. She was going about this the wrong way, wasn't she? She was sitting here, trying to come up with a way to win back the love of a pony, going about it like a pony princess, when what she should be doing was thinking like a changeling queen. With a wicked smile on her face, she ripped some parchment off a nearby shelf, picked up her quill and fresh pot of ink and, after a few false starts, penned a letter. My darling Queen Chrysalis. We've had many disagreements and misunderstandings over the years we've known each other, and I'm afraid our last conversation falls squarely into that category. While you made some good points and were clear when you said you wished never to contact me again, I'm afraid I must take issue with your declaration. Accordingly, I shall be by tomorrow morning to take possession of everything in your hive that belongs to me. Every single thing, with no exceptions made for anyone or anything. Including you. Right, counting the minutes until I see you again. Princess Twilight Sparkle. Chrysalis stared up at Twilight with her jaw hanging open. Her tongue flicked out, almost involuntarily, and she caught a flavor in the air. It was faint, given how far away its source was, but as all her thoughts of a new world of love and harmony rushed away, she recognized that flavor. Strawberry ice cream. With a snap of her teeth, she shut her mouth. She wanted to burst into a goofy grin, to cheer and dance and celebrate, but with a struggle, she managed to suppress those urges. After all, she was a queen in the presence of another queen who was threatening her hive. There were appearances to be maintained in these situations. Twilight Sparkle, she growled through clenched teeth, as her wings buzzed and lifted her up until she was face to face with the pony. "I don't know what you're planning or what your scheme is here, but I'm not going to let you get away with it." They smiled grimly at each other, their expression mocking. But their eyes met, and for just a moment their faces softened, and they shared the smiles of two ponies in love. Then, at the same second, they both swept forward, power crackling along their horns. They crashed together, their hooves flailing as each grappled for an advantage. Then their magic clashed, and the towering flare of power it threw up lit the surrounding countryside green and magenta for miles in every direction. Chapter 9. The Ceremony, Take 2. The library in Twilight's castle was always orderly. Case upon case and shelf upon shelf of books sat peacefully, carefully arranged by whatever system Twilight had decided on that week. Subtle spell runes glowed along the shelves to keep the books safe, and others lined the walls to mute outside sounds. A quiet hush filled the room, as befits such a solemn temple of learning. That silence was shattered, along with most of a window, as a tangle of purple and black limbs came crashing through the stained glass panes. Slamming into the floor, the clump of legs split apart, revealing itself to be bruised and battered pony and Changling. Twilight slid across the floor, sending several tables and chairs flying before coming to a rest in a pile of furniture. Chrysalis bounced off a pillar, spinning across the room and crashing into the opposite wall hard enough to make the books on the shelves jump, even with the protective spells on them. Wobbling, both climbed back to their hooves. Instinctively, their first action was to look over at the other, doing their best to remain circumspect, almost as though carefully making sure their partner wasn't hurt. Only then did they check themselves out, stretching out a sore limb or patting disheveled hair back into place. Twilight attacked suddenly, sending a storm of chairs flying across the room. But Chrysalis was at the ready, and a heavy beam of magic from her horn burned them all down mid-flight. For a moment, there was peace again as the two circled the room, heads down, stalking each other. Once more, Twilight was the first to act, charging across the crystal floor at full gallop, her head down and horn leading the way. Chrysalis ran out to meet her, horn similarly at the ready. But just before they collided, Twilight disappeared with a flash of magenta light, reappearing behind the Changling and unleashing a powerful bolt of magic from her horn. What Twilight had forgotten, however, was that Chrysalis had been obsessively following her every move over the past few years. So Chrysalis had been ready for the same tactic that an unicorn had used against Nightmare Moon, and Twilight's magic spattered harmlessly off the shield protecting Chrysalis' back. The Queen's sneer of triumph turned to shock as the princess charged back across the room, rearing up and slamming her hooves into the shield. Normally, even the impact of an unicorn at full physical strength would hardly be noticeable, and Twilight was tiring out. But after the running battle the two had been fighting, both their magics were also nearing their end, and the shield cracked under Twilight's assault. With two more blows it shattered, sending Twilight crashing into Chrysalis and knocking them both to the ground. For the next few moments they simply wrestled upon the floor of the library, hooves flailing and bodies twisting as each fought for an advantage. Twilight could get on top and try to pin the Changling down, but she never quite managed it in a way that gave her the leverage to stop the larger Changling from simply shrugging her off. Chrysalis similarly found herself unable to keep the pony in place. No matter what she did, the small pony wiggled and squirmed her way free. They separated again, panting, each carefully watching for a moment of weakness. Chrysalis took the first shot this time, grabbing chairs in her meager remaining magic and smashing them all together on top of Twilight even as she charged the pony. Twilight simply leapt lightly over the chairs with an assist from a flap of her wings. Chrysalis arrived as she touched down, rearing up and then slamming her hooves down. She struck only the hard crystal floor of the library, as her hooves passed through a magenta flash. Twilight reappeared directly above where she had been, flapping her wings to hover in place as she unleashed the last of her magic in a stunning bolt at Chrysalis. A bolt that struck only the air. Chrysalis appeared out of her own teleport in the air just above Twilight, having correctly guessed the use of the pony's favorite spell once again. Now out of magic herself, She struck down with both rear hooves, catching Twilight in the back and sending her crashing to the ground with a cry. Chrysalis landed just behind the pony, wobbling on her hooves. Twilight looked at her with wide, fearful eyes, then turned and began to struggle away. She dragged herself along with her front hooves, managing after a moment to begin getting her hind legs under herself so she could stand up. And as she did, Chrysalis pounced. She landed on Twilight, sending them both crashing to the floor. Twilight struggled violently, throwing her body back and forth as she sought escape, but Chrysalis followed her every move. She crouched above Twilight, stalking along with her movements, hooves herding the pony closer and closer to her own body, cutting off her every escape attempt. Finally, Twilight could move no longer, pinned firmly under the Changling. She gave a few weak wiggles, struggling with all the might she had left, but she may as well have been trying to move a boulder. They lay there for a moment, both breathing hard. Twilight was on her back, forelegs firmly caught between her barrel and Chrysalis, wings pinned under her own body. Chrysalis squatted atop her, hind legs trapping Twilight's body in place, their front hooves planted to either side of the pony's head. Finally, Twilight turned her head to the side and lifted her chin, exposing her neck, and gave the Changling a meaningful look. Grinning widely, fangs on full display, Chrysalis began to lower her open mouth. Twilight closed her eyes, just like she had the first time. She wanted to savor the moment. She felt Chrysalis' hooves, tight around her body. She heard the Changling breathing, panting partly out of exhaustion from their fight and partly out of anticipation. She smelled the scent of Chrysalis' carapace, a faint wisp of black licorice. Just as Twilight felt hot breath upon her neck and a set of fangs brushing against her coat, Chrysalis paused. Then she pulled back, and Twilight opened her eyes, looking up in confusion and worry. "Chrysalis?" she asked nervously. "Is something wrong?" "No," replied the Changling slowly, shaking her head, "but while I appreciate you going through a Changling wedding for me, I think I like the way you ponies end this thing better." The pony continued to look puzzled, and Chrysalis smiled down at her. "I do," she said softly. Twilight's confusion disappeared, and a bright, warm smile took its place. "I do," she replied. Chrysalis started to move down again, then almost reared back in surprise as Twilight launched herself upwards, wrapping her hooves around the Changling's neck and kissing her fiercely. This was no peck on the cheek, no hesitant enjoyment of a surprise and a tender wedding kiss, no simple kiss goodnight. Twilight melted into Chrysalis' embrace, letting herself finally express all the feelings that had been bottled up inside her for months. All the anxiety, all the fear and sadness, all the unfelt desire exploded out of her in that fiery, passionate kiss. They paused for a moment, foreheads resting against each other as they took deep, shuddering breaths, and then, mouths still open, came together again. Carefully, Chrysalis lowered Twilight to the ground, their bodies still wrapped together. Tentatively, almost chilly. Still remembering what had happened the last time she had kissed Twilight like this. Chrysalis' tongue poked gently into the pony's mouth. Again Twilight hesitated at the unfamiliar sensation of a forked tongue in her mouth, but only briefly, and both pony and Changling let out deep moans as their kiss deepened. For an endless, dreamy time, the two lay on the floor of the library, exploring each other's mouths, lost in the sheer pleasure of finally being able to express their love physically, the anticipation of knowing there was only more to come only heightening their pleasure. At some point, through the haze of joy, Twilight realized Chrysalis was silently weeping. Carefully separating herself from the Changling, she gazed sadly at her for a moment, not noticing her own tears, then moved forward and gently kissed the tears off Chrysalis' cheeks. Changling tears had a bitter taste, but she didn't mind, and didn't stop until they were all gone. At the same time, Chrysalis saw the pony's tears, and Twilight let out a giggle as a forked tongue tickled across her face and lapped up her tears. "I missed you so much," whispered Chrysalis hoarsely. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "So did I," Twilight replied breathlessly, eyes wide with wonder as she stared at the face she loved and gently stroked Chrysali's cheek. "I thought I'd never be able to find my love for you, and then I signed those stupid papers and realized you would be gone for good." She stopped, letting out a shuddering breath, and then buried her face in Chrysali's neck, kissing up and down her cheating. In turn, Chrysalis wrapped her forelegs around the pony and squeezed, taking up her favorite position with her chin resting on the top of Twilight's head. "I love you," murmured the changeling into Twilight's mane. "You do love me too, right?" "You know I do," Twilight replied with a happy sigh. "Would I have gone through all this trouble if I didn't? Besides, you can taste it." "Yes, but that's not the same as you saying it," insisted Chrysalis. "Hearing the words, hearing them come out of your mouth, knowing you mean them while seeing you actually say what I've waited so long for." "I love you, Queen Chrysalis," said Twilight, an adoring smile on her face. "You mean everything to me. There is no pony in Equestria, in the entire world, that I would rather be with than you. All I want to do." She stopped talking. She had to, as Chrysalis had begun smothering her face with kisses, and obviously she had to return the favor. Eventually, Chrysalis calmed down and settled for simply embracing the pony tightly. After only a moment of that, she raised her head. "So what do you love about me?" "Really?" asked Twilight dryly, raising an eyebrow. "I spent 6 months telling you how much I loved you and why," Chrysalis replied with a pout. "Don't I deserve the same?" "Well." Twilight slowly ran one hoof up and down Chrysali's neck. "I love your cheating. How it's so smooth, and tough yet flexible." Leaning in closer, Twilight rested her forehead against Chrysali's. "And I love your eyes. So many shades of green, all mixed into 2 perfect circles. It's like staring into a pair of the most beautiful jewels imaginable." She lifted up one of Chrysali's forelegs in her own. "I love your hooves, and every hole in them." She began kissing the hoof she held, and as she neared one of the holes Chrysalis suddenly snatched the leg back, something that looked suspiciously like a blush on her face. "Oh my, they're sensitive. I see, I see." Twilight chuckled, then, seeing the changeling's mortified expression, relented. "I love your wings, the way they shimmer in the light." Twilight ran the hoof down Chrysali's back. "I love the softness of your shell. I love everything about you, my queen." A shiver went through the changeling's body at those words, but then she turned away, looking back at Twilight out of the corner of one eye. "So you're only in this because of my body, then?" Twilight let out a groan, rolling her eyes, but obliged. "Well, I love your arrogance." "Confidence," interjected Chrysalis, with an offended sniff. "And I love that it makes you refuse to admit you're wrong, even when you know you are. And I can always tell you know, because you get an adorable pouty look on your face and refuse to talk." Chrysalis glared at her, cheeks puffed out, and Twilight chuckled. "Yes, that's the one." Chrysalis turned away with a huff, but Twilight put her hoof on the changeling's cheek and gently turned her head back to look her in the eyes. "And I love how much you care about, well, everything. Especially me. That intensity sometimes makes you do things I don't exactly approve of. But I wouldn't change it for the world." "Thank you. That's all I can say." Chrysalis smiled widely, tears shimmering in the corners of her eyes. Twilight could still remember a time when the sight of that smile would have sent her running for cover. But now all she did was smile back. "If anything, I should be thanking you," replied Twilight softly. "If you hadn't, well, messed up so badly and started all of this, I never would have known I could feel this way. So thank you." "We can call it a draw," Chrysalis said, with a toss of her hair and a widening of her grin. They kissed again briefly, then pulled back to gaze into each other's eyes. "So," said Chrysalis after a moment, "where shall we go for our honeymoon? I was thinking of Canterlot." After all, we'll need to claim our new thrones. Twilight turned her head sharply, gazing at Chrysalis with narrowed eyes, and the changeling threw her head back with a cackle. Or would you prefer the Crystal Empire? Either is fine with me. Our legions should be gaining control of both capitals within the hour. Twilight's expression softened into something that could have been called a smirk if there hadn't been so much love in it. I wouldn't mind visiting the Crystal Empire. It's beautiful, and I can't wait to show you around. But it might be better if we avoid it for some time. At least until certain issues have been cleared up. As for our legions invading both of them. No, they aren't. Excuse me? Asked Chrysalis, a fearsome frown on her face. What exactly makes you so sure of that? Because, said Twilight smugly, one of their queens informed them that, at least for today, any such actions would have to be approved by both their queens. Chrysalis stared at her, mouth dropping open. Then she snapped it shut, fury blazing in her eyes. You went over my horn? She snarled. Not exactly over. More to the side, replied Twilight, the smile still on her face. They are my legions too, aren't they? Chrysalis stared at her, mouth working silently as she tried to get out some kind of response, then she turned away. Yes, she admitted, grumbling. I won't do this again, Chrysalis, or at least not very often, said Twilight gently, touching the changeling's shoulder with one hoof. But today is a very special day, and I wanted it to be all about us. No invasions, no kidnappings, just us. In love, and married. Twilight's hoof suddenly tightened on the shoulder, and she flipped Chrysalis over, pinning her on her back. And don't think you're going to get away with anything like that from now on anyway, she growled in Chrysalis's face. You are stuck with me forever, and I will stop you. Every single time. Chrysalis blinked at her in something almost like fear, and then a smile grew on her face. Good, she snarled, I look forward to it. The changelings are busy right now, though, commented Twilight after a moment, and then smiled when Chrysalis looked at her questioningly. They're getting ready to move into their new hive. Chrysalis's expression didn't change for a moment, and then she gasped. You mean? You asked them to move here? And build a new hive under your castle? That's right. They should be here tomorrow, to start surveying the area and planning the excavation. Luckily, the castle has plenty of room for guests, and on top of that, I'm sure the Ponyville Hotel wouldn't mind a few hundred extra customers for however long the construction takes. The smile suddenly fell off Twilight's face. Oh. That was okay, wasn't it? I know I'm a queen now too, but I don't want to step on your hooves or anything and start ordering the changelings around all the time, and this was a pretty big move to make, telling them to abandon your current hive and all. No, it was fine, hushed Chrysalis soothingly, stroking the pony's hair. I told you I was planning on moving the hive under your castle, and you remembered and gave orders to that effect. I have no issue with you ordering our changelings to carry out decisions we've already made. And on top of that, you are a queen, the same as me. Your orders are my orders, and the other way around. One corner of her lips curled up, into a smirk. But if you truly wish to rule as a queen, you'll have to get out of that habit of apologizing. Royalty does not ask forgiveness, you command, and your wishes are carried out. There is no discussion afterwards. Well, that's something else we might have to agree to disagree on. Or, at least, it's a topic where we both have something that we can teach the other. Twilight gave her head a shake. In any case, I may have jumped the gun a bit with that order. I don't even know if this kind of construction is allowed in Ponyville. We'll have to get official surveyors out here, look up property and zoning laws, get some permits from the mayor's office. The mayor's office, you say? Mused Chrysalis, then looked down cross-eyed as Twilight booped her in the nose. You are not laying siege to the town hall again, growled Twilight. Bah. Jaywalking. What kind of a law is that? I will not pay a fine for simply strolling across a street that I own. For the last time, you do not own Ponyville. Neither do I. And if you'd simply showed up at your court date and apologized, they would have forgiven the ticket. A thunderous expression grew on Chrysali's face, and Twilight rolled her eyes. I don't mean apologize. But all you had to do was walk in and explain you hadn't meant to do anything wrong. That's it. What you didn't need to do was bring 3 full channeling legions into Ponyville and attempt to storm City Hall over 10-bit ticket. And you definitely don't need to do it again. Mayor was very forgiving after we got it all sorted out. But pushing her goodwill is the last thing we want to do, believe me. Chrysalis started to object, then stopped with a frown. You may be right, she conceded. I have to admit, the town hall's security force was much tougher than we had expected. And the mayor herself. Chrysalis gave a little shiver. I consider myself lucky that the other pony officials don't have her tenacity, or her ferocity. If Celestia had possessed such qualities, scaled up to her size and position, my first invasion may not have ended as well as it did. Far be it from me to say anything against the princess, but... Twilight looked around guiltily before continuing. Celestia is princess for life of Equestria. Mayor is an elected official. She has to fight for her office, and that tends to toughen a pony up pretty fast. Plus she doesn't just sit around on her big flank eating cake all day, pointed out Chrysalis. Don't say things like that, objected Twilight, squirming uncomfortably until Chrysalis calmed her with a flurry of kisses. There is still one thing we need to work out, though, said Twilight seriously, as they snuggled closer on the floor. Oh? Yes. It's about the wedding. Wedding? Of course. Chrysalis clapped her hooves happily. We need to have another wedding in Canterlot. With all your friends and family, and all our changelings. That's not what We can have another bachelorette party, and Rarity can make us new dresses. I wasn't. Wait, why would we need new dresses? Our old ones are perfectly fine still. It's only been 6 months. We can't wear old dresses to our wedding, gasped Chrysalis in horror. Besides, it's for real this time. It needs to be perfect. You've been spending too much time with Rarity, Twilight groaned. Okay, fine, new dresses. She won't mind anyway. And we can work out all the other details later. But that wasn't the wedding I was talking about. Chrysalis looked at her in puzzlement, and Twilight took a deep breath. I meant the first wedding. The one where we met. Oh. Chrysalis shifted uncomfortably. You still want me to apologize? Even though I was just doing what I had to do. I do want you to apologize, yes, said Twilight, nodding. I'm not going to argue about whether or not everything you did was necessary. We've been over that. I would still like for you to apologize for what happened, though. She held up a hoof. But I want you to mean it, Chrysalis. I don't want you to say you are sorry just to make me happy. You need to truly understand what you did, how it made me feel, how it made us all feel. If you understand that, if you actually do regret what you did, then say so. But I don't want an apology you don't mean. And don't think you have to do this. I won't love you any more than I do now if you do, or any less if you don't. What you did was terrible, but at least you had reasonable motivations, even if your actions can't really be called good or well-intentioned. And I think I forgave you for what you did a long time ago. Even when someone does something horrible, it's hard not to forgive them when they do it out of love and duty. So I'd like you to apologize. But you don't have to, and I don't want you to if you don't mean it. Silence reigned in the library for a time. Twilight could almost feel Chrysalis struggling to come to a decision. In fact, she actually felt the channeling shift in place, and take a breath to give a reply before halting and then letting the breath out in an almost silent sigh. Finally, just when Twilight had resigned herself to the thought that Chrysalis wouldn't be giving her an apology that day, the changeling raised her head. As she did, Twilight's horn glowed briefly. "Twilight," she said slowly, her eyes not quite meeting the pony's. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't just talk to you, to any of you. If I'd known what I know now, I could have just talked to you and let you know how I felt, or maybe even tried negotiating with Celestia. Even though conquest is just and honorable, and the way I do things, the way I prefer things, I could have saved so much time and effort and heartbreak if I just asked. And I'm sorry for what I did to Cadence. I felt like I was going to die when I lost you, and Cadence must have felt something like that when I replaced her. A little bit, at least. On top of that, I didn't need to do it all on her wedding day. That made it personal, and there was no reason to do that. Most of all, I'm sorry for what I did to you and everyone you love. You were all there for a special day, and I ruined that. I hurt you and your family, and that hurts me." She let out a defeated sigh, giving a lackluster shrug of her shoulders. "So there. An apology. A real one, probably the first one I've ever given that wasn't directed at my changelings. Thank you, Chrysalis." Twilight's horn lit up again as her hooves encircled the pained-looking changeling and squeezed tight. "You have no idea how happy it makes me that you did that for me." Chrysalis sighed, but hugged back. "I have at least some idea. Only someone who loves me and is this happy with me could taste like you do right now." "And just think," said Twilight excitedly. "This is just the first of many, many apologies you'll be giving over the rest of your life. You are going to make a wonderful pony princess, my dear heart." "What?" Chrysalis' head snapped upright. "You are out of your little pony mind if you think I am ever going to apologize again for what I've done or what I will do. Not even to my friends and family for the wedding, like you just did to me," asked Twilight with a pout. "Especially not for that." "Well, that's fine." Twilight's horn began to glow, and a set of crystals floated up from a nearby desk wrapped in her magical aura. In the middle was a large, dark purple crystal, roughly egg-shaped and covered in a multitude of facets. A faint shimmer came from deep within its surface, where motes of light danced. Surrounding it were 4 other, smaller crystals. These 4 were white and translucent, almost empty-looking. "What is that?" wondered Chrysalis, as Twilight's magical manipulation produced a brighter light inside the larger crystal. The light gathered in the crystal's facets, and then flowed out, forming 4 beams that connected to the smaller crystals. "Oh, it's this amazing artifact I found in the Crystal Empire after we defeated Sombra," said Twilight happily. The light in the bigger crystal disappeared, leaving the smaller crystals glowing faintly purple. Twilight's horn glowed a bit brighter, lifting one of the small crystals higher. She let out a pulse of magic from her horn, and an image sprang to life in the air. "Twilight," said the ghostly, floating Chrysalis, "I'm sorry." The real Chrysalis' mouth fell open as a perfect recreation of her apology played out in the air before her. "Isn't it fascinating?" asked Twilight giddily, talking over the replay. "The main crystal can record any event that takes place in a cube up to 15 feet across, and then play it back with complete accuracy at any time. And as many times as you want. And the smaller crystals can copy anything the main one has recorded, so you can distribute perfect copies of a recorded scene to as many ponies as you have crystals." No," stammered Chrysalis, futilely trying to get her hooves as the copied crystals floated away. She managed to get her legs under her body and reach the crystals just as they disappeared in a flash of magenta light. No. Chrysalis reared up, hooves flailing wildly through the air where the crystals had been. Where'd they go? Bring them back. Bring them back now. I sent them away, to some safe places that only I know about, replied Twilight. I'm going to show one copy each to my parents, Cadance and Shining Armor, my friends, and the princesses. Then I'll erase each recording. Chrysalis turned around, raw fury and panic burning in her eyes. You can't. You can't. I can, Chrysalis, Twilight said soberly. I want them to see you. The real you, not the monster who has attacked their kingdom repeatedly and ruined a wedding. It may only be once, but I want them to see what you are really like. To understand that while you willingly did every single horrible thing they experienced, that's not all you are. They can learn to tolerate you over time, maybe even like you, but if they can see you apologizing for what you've done, it will make everything quicker and so much easier. Breathing hard, one eye twitching, Chrysalis began to advance on Twilight, one lurching step at a time. But if you don't want me to, if you really don't want me to, I won't. I know how important your image is to you, and I know you think being seen apologizing will make you look weak. If this is something you really object to, I'll destroy those recordings. I just want you to know, it's important to me that you let me do this. I love you, and I want everyone in my life to know exactly why that is. I know you'd never show them willingly, and that's why well, I tricked you, a bit. I was even planning to wait to ask you for the apology if I didn't have something handy to record it with when we ended our wedding. I'm only doing this because I love you, hissed Chitter-Chirp. And I want to keep things between you and my other loved ones as peaceful and happy as possible. I've let you do a lot of things I didn't agree with. Like trying to murder all my friends at one time or another. Because I love you, and I understand it's just something you do. So, if you love me, truly, then please, let me do this. Chrysalis had made it to where Twilight still lay upon the ground, standing at her hooves. Now she stared down at the pony, eyes wide and blinking. You, she rasped. You're blackmailing me. You're using our love to force me to do something against my will? I'm not, Chrysalis, said Twilight with a smile, shaking her head. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. I'll still love you regardless. You are, insisted Chrysalis hoarsely, pointing a shaking hoof down at Twilight. It's not a choice if you say I'll do it if I love you. That's not what. Twilight cut off with a squeak, though she kept a smile, as Chrysalis' hoof pressed down on her throat with a not inconsiderable amount of force. You're lying there, blackmailing me into going along with your little plan to make me look weak, growled Chrysalis, leaning forward, breath coming in ragged gasps. You're using your love as leverage, forcing me to do what you wish against my will. She started to shake, and a snarl began to rise in the back of her throat. You. Chrysalis suddenly lunged forward, her fangs snapping shut close enough to the pony's muzzle to ruffle the fur on her coat, and Twilight didn't even flinch, the smug smile staying unmoved on her face. You are going to make a spectacular Changeling Queen, declared Chrysalis finally, and kissed her. The end. Epilogue. Cadance. Finale. The wind howled through the courtyard in front of the Royal Canterlot Gardens. The sky was sunny, but a cloud hung over this square, turning it drab and dreary. Aside from a few leaves skittering over the cobblestones, there was only stillness. The rest of the city hustled and bustled with multitudes of ponies going about their days, and the faint sounds of a celebration could be heard off in the distance, but in this courtyard no pony spoke. Shining Armor sat in front of the statue of Princess Cadance, staring up at his wife, and then slowly lowered his head. Cadance, he said softly, Cadance, I'm so sorry about this. I'm going to miss you, And I wish he could be here with me today. I know every pony else does, too. But what you did was awful. No matter what the excuse, what the provocation, you have to be punished. It hurts that you'll be gone, but if justice is going to be done, this is the way it has to be. The actions of ponies have consequences, even if that pony is a princess. And even if the princess is you. I know it might seem like it will be forever, but we'll be together again soon. I'm going to miss you for every second that we are apart, and you'll be the only pony I think of all that time. And hopefully, when we see each other again, you'll be able to understand why things had to be this way. Pushing himself to his hooves, he turned to head into the garden. Goodbye, Cadence, he said softly. But it's not fair, whined Cadence behind him, prancing up and down in front of the statue of Princess Twilight that flanked the other side of the entrance to the royal gardens. I already missed their wedding, now I have to miss the reception too. Shining Armor let out a sigh, turning back to trot over and stand by her. Yes, you do. That's what a restraining order means. And even if Twilight and Chrysalis didn't have one on you, you have one on them too, remember. But you need time to calm down, Cadence, and time to come to terms with the two of them being together. And after what you did, well, they need time to forgive you and recover from what you tried to do to them. I know. But Cadence looked over at him, her lower lip quivering. Can't we forget about that? Just put it all on hold, just for today. I should have been there for Twilight's wedding. Cadence. Shining Armor let out another sigh and shook his head. You could have been at her wedding the first time. You had the opportunity, she invited both of us. And you chose to do what, instead? Cadence mumbled and kicked at a cobblestone. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Cadence let out a groan, but said, I prepared myself for a war on Chrysalis. Which isn't a problem. In fact, had I not already known about them, I would have done the same. I'm talking about what happened after that, when you found out that Chrysalis really did love Twilight. What did you do when you knew it was true love, Cadence? I unilaterally decided that she didn't deserve Twilight. And then I spent months giving Chrysalis purposefully wrong advice for the explicit reason of destroying any hope of love between the two of them. And then? Cadence winced. Then I kind of attacked them, destroyed a restaurant, almost tried to kill Chrysalis, and tried to make Twilight love a pony that I had decided she should love rather than letting her choose for herself. Do you really think you deserve to go to the wedding and reception after all of that? Cadence hung her head. No, she mumbled. Shining Armor leaned against her, patting one foreleg around her and nuzzling up to her. So you do understand then, he said gently. After everything that's happened, it's better for all of you to stay apart, until the wounds can heal. They need to see that you truly can accept their love. And Twilight will, trust me. She's very forgiving. I know, said Cadence with a nod. And you need to see that they truly are in love, continued Shining Armor. As amazed as I am by the whole thing. They are. They actually are. Even more frightening, I think they're good for each other. Twilight can learn a lot about being a leader from her. The parts that aren't as nice, that is. As for Chrysalis, well, the more she learns about friendship the better. Even a little bit would be a huge improvement. They are kind of cute together, said Cadence hesitantly, then blushed when Shining Armor gave her a small smirk. Well, they are. And you're right about them being good for each other. If any pony can keep Chrysalis under control, apparently Twilight is the one. And Chrysalis might be able to help prepare Twilight for some of the more ruthless parts of being a princess, admitted Cadence grudgingly. Like, say, trying to attack your sister-in-law's wedding and ruin her marriage. Shining Armor asked with a raised eyebrow, and Cadence frowned at him. You know, as a princess, I can issue my own restraining orders, she said frostily, lips pursed and eyes narrowed, and I can apply them to things besides ponies. For instance, beds, and the activities that take place in them. Okay, I'm sorry, said Shining Armor nervously, holding up a hoof in a gesture of truce. I don't mean to keep bringing that up. I won't do it again. He gave her a look, seeing as how even as she nodded, her head was drooped and her shoulders slack. It's okay, he said softly, squeezing her again. Everyone knows you didn't really mean what happened. They'll forgive you. And I'll always love you, no matter what. I know, she said quietly, hugging him back. And how is our other project going? Shining Armor asked, taking a step back. It's going, responded Cadence, making a face, then groaned when Shining Armor frowned at her. I'm taking it seriously, I promise. It's just letting a bunch of changelings into the Crystal Empire? That's like letting foxes into a hen house. They're coming to help, Cadence. At least, they'd better be. But we need them. You know what a pain it's been trying to drag the Empire into the modern age. And not only do the changelings give us the bodies we need to do the work, thanks to Queen Chrysalis and the hive mind, they actually have experience with how things have changed over the past 1,000 years. It might not make up for what happened at our wedding, but I'm happy with a bit of forced labor for the Empire as payback for that. It's a fitting punishment, I'll agree with that, admitted Cadence grudgingly. Shining Armor cleared his throat meaningfully, and she winced. I'm working on my end too, but it's hard. I mean, finding a way to store love? I'm not a miracle worker. I know, Shining Armor replied soothingly. And we're not asking for miracles. Or at least not quick ones. But collecting and storing all the excess love the Empire and Equestria produce is going to be the key to living in peace with the changelings. It's too diffuse for them to feed off of properly, and there's a limit to how much they can all feed on individual ponies. He looked at her firmly. And finding a way to solve the problem is part of your punishment too, Cadence. After everything you did to destroy love for a changeling. I know, now I need to find a way to get love for all of them. Cadence shivered. I remember what the princesses said at the trial. I've never actually heard Auntie Celestia use the Royal Canterlot voice, but I think I would have preferred it to how she sounded. Yeah, well, if you'd been at some of the Royal Guard reviews I have, you wouldn't be saying that. I couldn't hear for a week. Cadence giggled at him, and Shining Armor smiled back. Then his expression sobered. Well, I'm glad everything seems to be going well on that end, but I need to head off to the reception now, he said gently. I'm sure they'll be wondering where I am. Are you going to be okay by yourself for a few hours? I'll be fine, said Cadence, shuffling her hooves nervously. Will you tell them? I'm sorry. Please, ask them to forgive me. I will, promised Shining Armor. And can you give Twilight and Chrysalis this? Cadence reached back, pulling a small, gaily wrapped box out from under her wing. Shining Armor took it, eyeing it warily, and pushed the lid back to look inside. There was a long moment of silence. Oh, Cadence, breathed Shining Armor finally. Inside the box, nestled in its soft silk lining, was a pair of earrings. One was shaped like a six-pointed starburst, carved out of a deep green emerald. The other, in brilliant amethyst, was a pair of hole-riddled insect wings. Both were placed in settings of the purest gold. They're enchanted with the same spell I used when I was talking with Chrysalis, explained Cadence meekly. They can't share the hive mind, but this way they can at least talk to each other whenever they're apart. She stopped with a gasp as Shining Armor put her into a fizz hug. "It's an absolutely perfect gift, Cadence," he said, pulling back to smile warmly as he gazed into her eyes. "They're going to love it, I promise. Trust the Princess of Love to come up with something as fitting as this, huh?" Cadence blushed. "I really am sorry about everything I did. And I thought that since I tried to break them apart, maybe I could do something that would help bring them together." "It's a wonderful thought. I'll be sure to pass it on." He gave her one last squeeze, then turned to head into the gardens. "Okay, I'm going now. I'll see you again in a few hours. Try to find something fun to do, maybe see a play or go to a concert. Just try to take your mind off everything for a while, okay?" "Okay, Shining Armor, I will." She watched him go as he walked into the gardens, until he disappeared around a hedge trimmed into the shape of Celestia and Luna's kitty marks. Hesitantly, she took a few steps forward, but then the warning tingle of the restraining order spell crawled up and down her neck, and she backed away with a small whine. She stood gazing at the gardens for a moment longer, then turned away, head down, and began to trudge back to her hotel room. There was no way to deny it, she had messed up. Bad. It was even worse than when Aunt Luna had turned into Night Mammon. At least Luna had had the excuse that she actually wasn't being given the respect she deserved, even if her reaction had been a bit out of line. But Cadence. She had acted out of spite, and jealousy, and pride. There was no excuse for that. And look where it had gotten her. She had nearly destroyed true love. An action anathema to her very soul. Because she had been so caught up in her own prejudices and preconceptions that she'd been blinded to its existence. She had hurt the sister-in-law and friend she loved so dearly, and even now she still wondered if Twilight would ever want anything to do with her again. And she'd done it all because she thought she knew the one true answer, that the only pony who Twilight deserved was Celestia. And why had she thought that? Because she was the Princess of Love, and therefore anything she thought about love had to be true. She let out a snort as she trotted drearily through the streets of Canterlot. That had turned out well, hadn't it? Not only had she nearly destroyed Twilight's love, but everything she had put Twilight through may have even hurt her relationship with Celestia. No doubt Twilight would be looking at her mentor through different eyes now that Cadence had nearly forced her to fall in love with Celestia. And to top it all off, Celestia was still alone. Her head slowly came up. Yes. Celestia was still alone, wasn't she? She might still have a bit of a crush on Twilight, but that would no doubt be fading soon now that Twilight was married. Celestia was nothing if not practical, and she would do everything she could to not let her feelings get in the way of her friendship with Twilight. So, she would need someone new to love now. Cadence began to trot faster. The immortality issue was something she'd have to consider, but when all was said and done, it wasn't a deal-breaker, just something that would be nice to have. More important was the pony themselves. They had to be kind, respectful of Celestia's elevated stature while not being intimidated by it, able to deal with the heightened public attention they would receive. She didn't have to worry about whether or not they would be attracted to Celestia. What pony wouldn't be? But getting Celestia to fall in love with them, on the other hoof. Well, I am the Princess of Love, aren't I? Cadence thought cheerfully, nearly prancing now. And if there's one thing I can do, it's make two ponies fall in love. Head held high, mind considering and rejecting various suitors for her aunt, Cadence continued down the street towards her hotel room. She had plans to make.